someone with a disability. So I'll just be talking about how I feel like the pandemic has impacted people with disabilities. So we kind of went over my introduction a little bit, but I do prefer they, them pronouns. Um, I'm double majoring in psychology, gender, sexuality, women's studies, and I have my email right there in case you have any questions or want to follow up later. So the agenda for today is I'm going to start with some warm-up questions to kind of gauge the knowledge on the subject because disabilities is a pretty wide subject. And I just want to see so I don't talk too much or too little about things. I'm going to hop into a presentation where we'll talk about these issues and ways to engage in inclusive leadership. Then we'll go into a discussion where we talk about the presentation, our experiences, maybe what you've gained from it, what, like that kind of thing, and then the Q&A. So the warm-up activity. So I have a few questions. I think we're going to start with the first one. What does accessibility mean to you? If you could unmute or put something in the chat, that would be great. Just so I can see like what your knowledge base is.
To me, accessibility refers to like being able to have people approach you easily without much fear. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, someone in the chat. Equal services and equitable access to goods and services for all individuals, universal access to similar activities. So yeah, there's a lot. Accessibility is pretty broad, but I feel like you guys have gotten the basis, being able to access and benefit from something. So yeah, I feel like the second and third question go together really well. But what do you think of? What's the first thing you think about when you think of disability? And then what comes to mind when you think of invisible disability? It's okay to use the chat or out loud. I'm pretty flexible with that.
When I think about disability, I think about my friend who actually has an invisible disability, and she was working on dialogue regarding, instead of saying despite disability, kind of changing the dialogue to be like disability and. So with those two going in mind, I think about her.
That's good that you have a person that you can reference and you probably know a little bit about experience. So that probably does give you some good background on this. And disabilities aren't obvious from looking at a person. I think that's a well said statement. So how do you think social distancing or early pandemic times affected people with disabilities? I feel like this is the tricky question because that's our main focus today. Loss of accessibility and resources. It may revoked access to things people with disabilities needed. Yeah, good points. Okay.
Oh, sorry. If I
No,
can add to that, I also have a family member who's disabled, and I think that for them, they were talking about how I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought.
no worries.
They were talking about how, people wearing masks and that kind of thing and that kind of hindrance was like a quote unquote disability for people, in the sense that something that they had before was being hindered by a mask, and how it's a little bit of a semblance in that regard, if that makes any sense at all.
A little bit, a little bit. Um, yeah. So, and then what does inclusive leadership mean to you? We had a thing in the chat. There was definitely a big scramble to reconstruct different societal things, i.e., job and school, that disability accommodations were largely overlooked. And I think that's a good point, and that is something I do touch on. Okay, so I think we're ready to jump into the presentation. I think we had a good conversation and we did cover some good ground. So kind of going into things. Let me set up my computer for a second. Okay. So presentation, what is a disability? A disability is any condition of the body or mind that makes it difficult for a person with a condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. I like the CDC definition because it was very health-oriented, logical, but I also really liked this one from the World Health Organization because I feel like it humanizes disability experiences. So disability is part of being human, and almost everyone will have a temporary or permanently experience a disability at some point in their life. I feel like this is significant because it does show a little bit about the array of disabilities. They don't look the same. They're not always permanent, all those things. So these are following definitions of the 13 categories provided under IDEA. I highlighted and bolded some of the ones that will be mostly the focus for today. But all of these can apply in very different ways. So from my personal experience and the disabilities that I have, or other health impairments, which could be chronic illness. Usually people feel fatigued. They might not be able to work a full-time job, those types of things. Specific learning disability. This is what you think of like early education, people with dyslexia, dyscalculia, things that make it harder to learn. And then speech language impairment. Personally, I was in speech therapy for 10 years from the age of 3 to 13. So I will try to speak as clearly as I can today, but sometimes I will stutter over words. And then multiple disabilities. It's just when someone has a combination of different disabilities. So someone can have a visual impairment and an emotional disturbance, and that will just be categorized as multiple disabilities, and that can be applied in several different ways. And then deafness is something I do not experience, but I felt like it did apply to some of the things that I was talking about, because I have an auditory processing disorder, which means that, like, when someone talks to me, I lip read a lot, just to understand and process what people are saying to me. It's not that my hearing is nothing is my hearing is perfect. It's more of like just my brain trying to interpret what is being said to me. So yeah. So benefits to disabled people during the pandemic. So there was increased accessibility in the early pandemic when everything suddenly went into Zoom and virtual formats. There was some increased accessibility to classes and meetings through web-based platforms. So I know something that I really appreciated, especially now, since some classes have been still been virtual, are automatic voice-to-text captioning. With learning disabilities and having trouble keeping up in class sometimes, being able to read the captions along with the teacher's voice really helps me. And I know it could help a lot of other people. Access to space without physical presence. So people could be able to attend a meeting, attend a job, attend a class without physically being there. And that could be significant for people with chronic illness who might not be able to, might have a bad health day and might not be able to leave their space, but they could still participate, which is a big deal. Ability to have the camera off. So again, if someone's having a bad health day, they can still be there, but they have the privacy if they feel like they need it that day. And this also brought some decreased risk to immunocompromised individuals of obtaining illness because of all the virtual options. If they were concerned about their health before the pandemic and going out and that kind of stuff, having these options on Zoom did give them the ability to participate in more things despite their health. There was increased opportunities to participate. So in a normal in-person circumstance, the main form of communication is discussing gestures, but on Zoom, you can use Zoom polls, chat boxes to give people with social anxiety, other disabilities, able to engage in a conversation, engage in the activity. So I think that gave more accessibility to others. And then the flexibility in work hours. The ability to work from home, again, gives the people that might be immunocompromised or might not be able to normally hold a full-time job due to their health or disability, access and accessibility to do that, and increased flexibility doing work throughout the day. I know as a student, I had some virtual classes, but I also had a lot of asynchronous activities, which gave me more flexibility to do things when I felt like it was best for me. So those are some things that happened during the early pandemic that I wanted to mention. But I do want to talk about current issues. I think as we're moving now, the start of the pandemic was 2 years ago, but now we're moving slowly back into in-person activities. So that means some of those benefits are going away as we move into almost normal life. So barriers with communication due to masks. Masks are popular. Masks are starting to phase out a little bit, but with masks, lip reading and signing could be more difficult. I know I sometimes struggle with understanding people with masks, and sometimes people have to have more patience with that. And I know there is a thing of like clear masks where people can still lip read, but I don't feel like they're very common. I don't know if I've seen anyone wearing clear masks before. So in-person special education services support and struggle to transfer into virtual formats. So this is a situation of in the early pandemic, when schools suddenly switched into virtual formats, they struggled to transfer such education services and resources and all of those kind of things, kind of leaving those kids behind. So they wouldn't, because they weren't able to receive the resources they needed. Some people with disabilities that are high risk for COVID-19. So people that are immunocompromised, no one was really understanding what was happening at this point, like very early pandemic. No one was really understanding what was happening. People were confused, and no one knew what was safe and what was. People were just told to stay home, wear a mask, and then don't leave unless you need to. So people with immunocompromised systems or chronic illnesses may not have felt comfortable going to work, grocery shopping. I know at this time I worked at a grocery store and I saw several people told me that they were getting groceries for their grandmother, an elderly neighbor, or a friend that was immunocompromised. So this was like an everyday thing. The pandemic increases issues of underrepresentation in the workforce. So I got this from a government document, and there's already an underrepresentation in the workforce, but during the pandemic, because things shut down and people with immunocompromised or chronic illness and people that didn't have services weren't able to keep the job even if it was essential work. So that rose some issues. And then mental health risk due to pre-existing shortage treatments, personal support, and professional mental health support. So this is again when it suddenly went from in-person to fully virtual. Telehealth took some time to develop and other things like that. So treatment programs that could be served online. So people with disabilities didn't have the mental health resources to support. Especially if they were really social distancing, they weren't able to see and have their social support circle close to them. So how can you accommodate this as a leader? Of course, you can't control everything, but the little piece that you can control, how can you help? Every disabled person will need different accommodations. Showing that you'll be open to change can be beneficial in increasing inclusivity. So sending a general message to initiate a conversation on how you can accommodate on an issue, checking in and supporting the individual. I would say like in a general sense, like sending an email out to everyone about please contact me if I can accommodate you, and not assuming how to accommodate. Offering alternative outlets, so virtual meetings, flexibility with work, because as we talked about before, sometimes people with disabilities are not able to, it's more accessible to have those accommodations. Providing resources, so having like a poster about mental health resources for people with disabilities. Those little things can help a lot. And being receptive to feedback. And because maybe the way you think you should accommodate someone might not be the way that helps. We will dive into that a little deeper. So the individual should feel supported and not the center of attention. So it shouldn't be all attention on them when you ask about someone with a disability. So first, I want to start with Rebecca Tossig, author of Sitting Pretty. I really like to quote, I've been paralyzed since receiving cancer treatments as a toddler, and I started using a wheelchair in first grade. So I've had 30 years to learn how capable I am and just how often people assume I'm useless. So there's a stigma around people with disabilities that they're helpless and they can't do things the way like normal people do. And a lot of times they can, but they just have to accommodate it for them. So how can I accommodate these issues as a leader? So an individual should feel supported and not the center of attention due to their accommodations. So there shouldn't be, because I feel like there's a pressure when I personally feel accommodations that people think I'm getting special treatment or more attention is on me because I might need extra time on assessments. So not putting that extra attention on someone. Some people with disabilities feel like they're sent out when they're treated differently from their peers. So for example, if a boss is asking an individual about their disability or their accommodations in front of peers, again, that's unwanted attention that might be better if it was the boss checking in on everyone, a general email, or just a private conversation. And an alternative approach would be to occasionally check in with all the peers, send an email. Make sure that you're not changing your behavior when you're interacting with a disabled person. In my experience, since I was younger, when people sometimes hear my disability, hear me stutter, they will change their voice to like something a little higher pitched or like slow down their language or speak simpler, even though that I would be able to understand their normal language. So I noticed that and it doesn't make me feel great. So not changing your behavior in that way and not assuming anything about the person because they display a disability. And then it just brings unwanted attention when someone is talking to you like that. So avoid assumptions about individuals' ability and allow them to communicate how they might do a task differently. So an example of how someone can do something differently is normally when an abled person is told to read some textbook pages, they just open a book or open the document on their computer and they read it. And sometimes with my dyslexia and other learning disabilities, that just, it will not stick in my head. I will not understand a word that I'm reading. So at times I have a software on my computer where it can read documents to me, which is really great. So I'm getting the same information and I'm doing the same task, but just in a different way. So understanding there's different ways to do things. It is important to accommodate with people with disabilities, but it can be difficult to change your behavior or address someone's differences. So just understand that everyone's different and not everyone is going to need the same thing. So the main takeaways, disabilities come in a variety of combinations of mental health and emotional differences. Many issues have increased during the pandemic due to social isolation procedures. In most situations, the person with the disability is the most knowledgeable of their accommodations and needs. So biggest takeaways, every person requires different needs and accommodations. Even if they have the same disability, they have different needs because they can present differently. A person might use a technique that is better for them. And don't assume, again, like you can't predict it. Only the person who's experiencing the disabilities can communicate that. It is okay to offer help, but treating an individual differently than an able person can be seen as offensive. Like when I talked about how someone might talk differently to me when they hear my speech impediment or see my health chart. Many disabled people have lived with this disability for their whole life, for her life, if not for a while. So they already understand like the stigmas of how they could be treated differently, how people might assume they need accommodations they don't. For example, the author that I read that quote off of earlier, with the wheelchair, I remember she talked about how she was used to taking a wheelchair and putting it in the car several times a day for her job. And sometimes strangers would just randomly help without asking. And even though it was made with good intention, it just felt like it felt offensive because it made her feel like she was incapable of doing it herself. So that's why it's so important to not assume, ask, be polite, be receptive to accommodations and suggestions. Again, not every disability is going to be the same, and not every way to accommodate that disability is going to be the same. And understand, that a disabled individual may not do the task the same way you would. So, yeah, those are the main takeaways. So, kind of going into the discussion, I think this should be open. So we can start with question one. Some of these are repeating, some of these have expanded a little bit, but after a conversation, what does inclusive leadership mean to you? Again, like chat box or talking out loud, is both are okay.
Inclusive leadership seems to be allowing people that are differently able to participate in society in a way that doesn't erase their identity, but facilitates their ability to participate.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it. Does anyone have any other responses, thoughts? I saw we got a chat. Working to give everyone the same opportunity to thrive, even if the person has different needs, providing a platform for people from all walks of life to engage in activity, to feel heard, respected. Yeah, I think that's good, yeah, good points. Being accommodating is not synonymous with helping. Giving someone the space to do their own way and making it known that you can be a resource if needed. No, I think that's a great way to put it, especially since I talked about before, people assuming that they need to accommodate in ways when it makes you feel like, for the disabled individual, it could feel like they're not capable, like the person thinks that they're not capable of doing a certain thing. Like in the examples that I've said, like people changing their tone and voice, it makes the individual feel like they're not capable of understanding normal English or articulate thoughts. So how has your view of accessibility and disability changed?
I mean, I've gotten a lot more. I mean, I wouldn't say used to them, but I mean, it's just become a part of my life in a bigger way.
Mhm.
All of us actually feel the same way.
May I ask you to expand on that?
Hmm?
I don't know if you cut out, but would you be able to expand on that
I
for
mean,
me?
I mean, I've become a lot more open to virtual meetings now that COVID has happened than before.
Yeah, true, true. Okay, good point. Anyone else? Perspective. What may be seen as a good deed by one person could be unwanted or overbearing by another. So that is what someone said in the chat. I think this is a great point because everyone might need accommodated differently. Not all disabilities look the same. And even people with the same diagnoses or disability might not present or need the same things. So Anyone on question 3 or
I can answer question 3. In terms of how my perspective has changed about virtual meetings and things like that. For me, I'm kind of like almost in a mindset because my brother's visually impaired. And so usually with virtual meetings, I'm thinking about all the ways that it doesn't benefit him and people with visual disabilities because although there's like speech to text, sometimes it doesn't read what's on the screen when you're in a Zoom. But then I never really took the time to consider that, with the spectrum of other disabilities, how that could work to some people's advantage. And I think that in that way, just kind of balancing out the pros and the cons of virtual learning, virtual meetings based on individuals' needs.
yeah. And I think you make a great point because I feel like I talked mostly about my experience and what I understand based on my disabilities, but having someone that doesn't benefit from virtual meetings, it just kind of shows the diversity in disabilities and perspectives and what people need versus what doesn't work. So I appreciate you talking. Anyone else before we move on?
I think I just want to comment and emphasize on the fourth question, which I think is a very valuable question. And just kind of going back to what you mentioned in your presentation, Jolie, about not speaking to people a different way or acting necessarily in a different way because of a disability, whether that is invisible or not. I know that like my brother's received a lot of like, I've seen a lot like from an outsider's perspective, when my brother's talking to people and then they find out that he's legally blind, they start looking at him sideways, talking different, acting different. But had he not mentioned such a thing, dialogue continued the way that it did. So I think just treating people as normal people, the way that they deserve to be treated. And again, going back to Melina's point, providing resources, providing yourself as a resource if they need it, but not necessarily to change because someone doesn't look like you or doesn't process things the same way that you do.
Yeah, and I appreciate your feedback, and I'm happy that you were able to like take that away from my presentation because I feel like that was one of the most important things to me is expressing like don't change your behavior. Like changing your behavior is not the way to accommodate. And I was trying to separate those two differences of what it means to accommodate versus what it means to change your behavior because they're not the same thing. In the chat, someone said being an inclusive leader means being open to change at any time and having the ability to listen instead of assuming. So I think that's great. I think assuming is one of the big words of this presentation, and understanding that people will need different things. So yeah, I think if our conversation's done, I'll wait a second, see if anyone has anything else to say. Okay, so we're in the next is just a Q&A portion. So if you have any questions, concerns, other perspectives, or other things that I might have not even thought about, feel free to raise them in the chat or verbally. I would love to hear anything. So
I'll start with a question. Do you feel like there's anything we need to do as a leader building up to that email, asking if anyone needs any accommodations to establish trust where they would feel comfortable voicing those extra things that they may need or that they would do differently?
yeah, I mean, honestly, in my experience, I don't know. I don't think so, at least in my perspective. What I appreciate is instead of like, is something subtle. Like one of my advisors emailed me the other day, and it might have been for this event actually. And at the bottom of her email, it just said, please contact me if we can accommodate this event for you in any way. And that meant so much to me, even though it was so subtle, because it gave me the power to step in if I needed I didn't need accommodations, but I feel like it gave me the power if I had needed an accommodation, it made it feel more inclusive, and it felt like I would be able to do that. Like it felt very accepting. So I felt like that was a good approach as a leader. Of course, some people might be different, but at least from my experience, that's how I feel.
How would you say that accessibility has been for you in like college compared to like prior schooling that you had, like elementary, middle, high school, and things like that?
Yeah. So for some context, the 2020 pandemic happened my senior year of high school. So kind of for me, it's almost like virtual schooling versus in-person schooling. I feel like in some ways, with chronic health issues, injuries, the virtual format for school has been very helpful. But I feel like as we've eased into in-person, I have ran into some issues with having trouble getting to class and that kind of thing because of health issues. I would say beforehand, in elementary school, attendance was the same issue due to other health concerns and that kind of thing. I feel like I don't feel like I could say there's a significant difference. I feel like I have very similar accommodations for both, and I've run into some issues. I feel like maybe the biggest thing is I feel like I'm less likely to be treated differently in a university setting, like people adjusting the voices or adjusting the behaviors. And I appreciate like that change when I transitioned into college, like people were treating me different. And I don't know if it's because here at Pitt, TRS accommodations, the professors don't receive your list of disabilities. They receive your list of accommodations. And I wonder if that helps with them not treating you differently because they're seeing your disabilities and they're just receiving what you need or what you would benefit from in class. So I hope that answers your question. I feel like it's a difficult question, but a good question.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, I have another question. It's kind of off topic. So I saw on your information page that you're a stamp scholar.
Yes.
I'm actually another one. I'm going to be going to Purdue in Indiana. So what got you into, well, actually, how has your stamp scholarship experience been for you?
It's been great. I've really enjoyed the process, the leadership, experiences that we've had. I will be using my enrichment funds this fall to go to London. So I'm super excited.
Oh, nice.
I've enjoyed the experience. Was there another question? I forget.
No, that's all I have.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good luck with the upcoming semester. Yeah, and don't be like worried to ask a question or a clarification. I know I covered a lot of information in a short time, so I'm very understanding.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you think that your studies at the University of Pittsburgh, double majoring in psych and in gender and women's studies, has helped you contribute to this presentation?
Yeah. I think I really like psychology because I like understanding human behavior. And I feel like in psychology, we do cover a lot about disabilities because we kind of talk about the abled, but we also talk about different diagnoses. And I feel, at least in research I've seen, a lot of people with disabilities have an increased risk of obtaining mental health issues just because they're put in a place where they can face the stigma. They might not face the treatments they have. They could feel isolated and because they're different. So that can increase mental health risks. So I feel like the psychology background has helped me to understand those connections a little better. And then the gender, sexuality, women's studies perspective, I've recently just added that on as a major. Um, I think it's great because I feel like it's one of the most inclusive environments for me to talk about anything I want to. Because, yeah, of course, it's about mostly focusing on gender, sexuality, and women's studies. But we do talk about ableism and how different things affect like a disabled body versus an able body, and how will that body be treated versus another body. We just the conversation is very open, and I feel like the people in the classes are very open to learning something new and listening to others. So I feel like it's an enriching experience to be able to learn how to discuss those issues.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So someone said in the chat, what do you plan on doing after graduating college? So it depends. I am hoping to pursue, and my end goal is to pursue a PhD in psychology. I'm looking into maybe going abroad for graduate school, which would mean I would have to obtain a master's before going into a PhD program. In the United States, I'd be able to just jump into the PhD program. But that is kind of the plan. I'm very flexible with, I have to do a few things and we'll see where I go, but I'm hoping that that's my endpoint. Does anyone have any final questions? I know some people are hopping off. So if you did come, I appreciate it. Thank you. But yeah, I'm gonna just stay for questions. But yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Perfect. And we just want to go ahead and thank Jolie for presenting. Thank you all of the participants who have joined us today. This is the final session of the summit. So if you haven't already, you will receive an email with a link to a survey. We ask that you please complete the survey at your earliest convenience to share some feedback about your learning experience today. And thank you all for joining us. I'm gonna go ahead and stop my recording.